My name's Sasha Pete, and I'm joined by a fantastic individual. This man scored goals for fun. He represented both club and country with great pride. None other than the great John Kosmina. Welcome, John.
Hey, Sash, how are you, mate?
Very good, thank you, sir, and congratulations on your induction to the Football Federation Australia Hall of Fame. That probably caps off your fantastic contribution to Australian football. But tell us, John, how did you fall in love with our great game?
Well, my father was Polish, so he came out after the war and ended up in Adelaide. Met my mother; she's an Aussie, and basically we grew up in Port Adelaide, which is like an Aussie rules stronghold. But he wanted us to play soccer as it was then, so soccer we did. My younger brother, got two younger brothers as well, so we used to have great fights out in the backyard.
So what was the Polish community like in Adelaide growing up? And was it a tight-knit community?
It was. I think I actually miss it to some extent, and I think that sort of sense of community's gone from football. I mean, you still get it in bits and pieces, but I certainly know the Polish community is nowhere near as strong as it used to be. There were a lot of Polish migrants in Adelaide at the time, and so we grew up in the Polonia Soccer Club.
Mm-hmm.
And he never really, Dad actually played for them, but he sort of gave it away for a few years. He broke his leg and didn't play, and then went back to the club to get involved in the management side of it when I would have been probably 9 or 10 years old. And that was when we sort of first came into real close contact with football on a regular basis. So we were there, all weekend basically. We watched all the teams play. You don't get that anymore with young kids. They go and play their game and they're off. Very few turn up or stay behind to watch the 18s or the 23s or the first team. But we'd be there at midday for the juniors and probably get home at 10 o'clock that night after Dad spent a bit of time in the bar with his mates.
Oh, that sounds great. So I take it you're 9 and 10 years old. You're at Polonia Adelaide, kicking the ball around with your mates. When did you first start playing in the junior ranks there?
Look, it started at school first because back then, I'm talking the late 60s. They never had juniors as such in Adelaide. The youngest age group there in South Australia at the time was under 16. So I sort of ended up in 1968. We got a school team together, and even the school was an issue because, as I said, it was Port Adelaide, Aussie rules stronghold. And so soccer wasn't played at the school. So Dad sort of and a few of the other parents, we used to play because there was a couple of English kids, Pommy kids that came to the school that actually played the game. So we got a team together. We started to play at lunchtimes and then started to get a few more kids that wanted to play. And as a result, they ended up getting a school team put in the local competition. And so that started first. And then I would have been 12, I ended up getting a bit of a sniff with the under 16s at Polonia. Wow. Probably more because Dad knew the coach really well and weaseled me in there. It's like the hanger-on sitting on the bench, which I didn't deal with too well at the time. I remember it now. It used to annoy me, but because the kids were much bigger than me, but it actually helped me a lot because it was, I was 11, 12 years of age and these guys are 15, 16 and a lot more physically developed, obviously. And so it was a bit of a good learning curve for me.
And how soon was it before you started to feature in that under 16 side? Was it?
I never did. The next year, they got an under 14 competition up and running in South Australia for the local clubs in the Adelaide suburban area. Mm-hmm. So what happened then was I went to under 14s.
Okay.
And then, but I always played. I was 13 playing under 14s, and then the next year I went to under 16s. And then, 15, I was in the juniors, but then juniors were part of the senior club. Juniors were under 18 at the time, from memory. And that's when I started sort of getting a bit of a run with the first team.
Do you credit that sort of playing against bigger physical bodies to your development as well? Obviously, the Dad having the upbringing that he did, pushing you towards coming from a football family. on your dad's side, and that notion of having to compete against people who had, the better first touch, the bigger body, the faster football.
To survive, and that was. And look, you can talk about first touches and stuff, and they were a bit more skillful, because it's funny, because a lot of the kids that I grew up with, whether they were in the Polish club that I was at, or they were Italian kids, and our school was a bit of a potpourri, mainly Aussies, but there was a few Italians and a few Greeks, and then when I went to high school in that area as well, there was a lot more. So there was a real it was culturally diverse, and all of the kids were from football families, from soccer families. They played Aussie rules as well. We all did, because that was just what you did. It was part of growing up, but because soccer was virtually unheard of. But I think being in, seeing a lot of those, playing and mixing with a lot of those other kids helped me a lot, because these kids grew up in a football environment, which I more or less did as well. And so that made a difference. And then obviously, look, what I was going to refer to eventually was a lot of the Polish kids that I played with, and most of that under-16 team played for the state that year, and they in the under-16 championship. So because they used to have state under-16s all the time back in those days, and a lot of those kids were good players. And I ended up playing with quite a number of that squad in the senior team at Bologna a few years afterwards. So they were all good footballers. So that actually helped me a hell of a lot, because you've got to survive.
And so you're growing up. Did you gravitate to the front of the pitch? Is that somewhere where?
No, I was always a midfielder.
Midfielder, okay.
I think there was an old system called the WM formation, where you had, fullbacks and centre backs and midfielders and things like that. And I played as a number 10, which was like a number 10 plays now, more or less. But I ended up playing a bit deeper sometimes. You just played the middle of the park. We ended up, as we got a bit older, played a 4-3-3, and that's what it was. Essentially, a WM, you can move the players around to make it suit the shape, or to get the shape to suit the players. And so I played as a midfielder, and I even had my debut with Bologna in the senior team when I was 16 as a midfielder, not as a striker. And then one time at training, one of the older players said, "Look, we were short of strikers. We weren't getting anywhere with what we had," and they'd said, "Try me up front," because I'd scored a lot of goals as a young kid from midfield. So I played up as a 9, and that was the end of it. I never went back.
That's a great story. 16, and you're playing first team for Bologna. Would have that been? So was it a surreal moment? Were you proud? What was the feeling?
I can remember, my first game, or that season would have been. I was 16 going on 17. My birthday's in the second half of the year, so I remember, debuting, and it was just so fast and quick, and everything was happening at 100 miles an hour. The game was a blur. And it was just a struggle to stay alive. But because I was playing against 30-year-olds, guys that had played. I remember playing against an Italian side, Juventus, and it's like there's a couple of those blokes who played for Australia at that stage. They'd been in national team squads, and they played a lot of games for the state against touring opposition. As a lot of clubs used to come out in those days from either Europe or the UK, and they played state teams in our season, which was obviously their summer. So these guys were fairly old heads, and I just remember everything was just that quick. It was a blur, and I don't remember when it settled down. It just seemed to. Once you found your feet, it was fine. You just had to battle to stay alive, though. That notion of playing for your boyhood club, the club where your dad is involved in. Running of the club, I'm sure, sorting out the canteen, drinking with his mates, that whole ethos. Did you also then gravitate to that part of football? So the camaraderie of, the players that you played with, became friends with, and socialised with? Could you draw that thread of how you would watch your father associate in his club? Yeah, probably I never used to think about it, but now that I think back when I used to go to the pub after training with all the blokes I used to play with, maybe that was a throwback to what I learnt from my old man. Oh, look, it was part of it. We lived because in the area where the ground was, and we lived in Port Adelaide. The ground was actually in an area called Croydon Park, which is probably about, I don't know, 8-10 k's maybe from where we lived. But that whole area was Polish. Like this, in all of the streets, all of the kids that played for the club, some lived across the road. They were within probably 200 metres of the ground.
Yep.
So they spent a lot of time there. So, we'd meet it before the junior team kicked off when we were little kids or younger kids, and just hang out the whole day. And then, the minute it was half time, we'd be on the pitch. Then when the game finished between matches, you'd be on the pitch. And then when the first team was over, and Dad was in the club socialising with his mates, we'd be just playing football. And we used to play in the dark because they turned the lights off. We just spent hours and hours playing football. You don't get that these days. It doesn't happen. Well, one is you're not allowed on the pitch to start with, which is a pity. I think it'd be great if you could do that. I know at Hindmarsh, back in when I'm pretty sure it happened at Adelaide United, we got permission to allow the kids to come on the field at the end of a game, and it just makes such a difference. It's exciting for the kids, but these days you can't do that. OH&S and you've got lawyers that want to sue the backside out of everybody. If something goes wrong, the club's liable for it, and so it's just not allowed. It's a pity, really. It's a real throwback to a bygone era, but they were great times.
It was, I think, around the mid-70s that you first represented our country. Do you remember your first game for Australia?
Yeah, it was against. I said yeah, but I couldn't remember who we played against. I think it was against Bologna, Italian side. They were Serie A at the time, and they came out, played national team, and my debut was actually at Hindmarsh in front of my home crowd. We won 3-0, and I had a blinder. So it was great, really good to get a debut at home. It's funny, I look at where the Socceroos, they live in the lap of luxury now. But I was brought into the squad. There was myself and I think 2 or 3 other South Australians in that squad, and we went in to meet like the night before when the team got there. We had dinner, but we had to go home. They didn't have the hotel rooms for us, and it was a pretty crappy motel. It wasn't a hotel; it was a motel. And they compared then to now, and it's just chalk and cheese. But it was just great. I had a couple of guys in the team, obviously, that I knew the starting lineup. They were looking to revamp the squad after the 74 World Cup, and things worked out well for me. And it was sort of onward and upward from there.
And you transfer that same year or year after, was it to West Adelaide?
I went from the state league. National League started the next season. National Soccer League, Phillips League. And so I went from my club, Bologna, to West Adelaide because they were admitted into the competition. And I wanted to play that next level up. So it pissed off a few of the Poles, I think, because I'd left the club because they wanted me to be patriotic. But it's sort of gone beyond that. Then I wanted to play football at the best level possible. So I moved on, and that was the end of it.
And would you regard the difference in quality? Is it a 30-40% difference between the state league in South Australia and the first year of the Phillips?
No, I wouldn't. It's hard to put a percentage on it. I mean, the club that I actually played for, we were always, we won it in 75. My big season was we were always top 2 or 3. That was certainly in my time there. As a senior player, and so it's hard to say that NSL was 20% better than the local competition because what happened was a lot like it was West Adelaide and Adelaide City went in from Hellas and Juventus, a Greek club and an Italian club, and both clubs already had good players, and then they brought a smattering of players like myself in from like Polonia, which was a Polish club. There was another club called Belgrade, which was Serbian. There was Croatia. There was, a few other clubs around the place. Elizabeth, which was basically an English club. Was founded in an area called Elizabeth, which had a lot of English migrants that came out, the 10-pound pom, so to speak. So the standard was obviously better because you had a greater concentration of better footballers, and then also because it was a national competition, we had a couple of guys come from interstate as well. So it was a good competition. It was a decent standard. There was some decent footballers in it. Obviously, the conditions were a lot different than what they are now. We played in winter, so you didn't spend a lot of time playing on grassy pitches. Life was a little bit different.
The on a tour of Arsenal, you represent the Socceroos. I think it was at the Sydney Cricket Ground, and Arsenal came out, and I think you got the first goal. And then soon after, you're wearing an Arsenal shirt. So talk to me at firstly that game, and then what had transpired for you to then go to England.
There was a tournament. There was Celtic, Red Star, and Arsenal came out and played Australia. And we played Celtic at the SCG as well. The old, not the cricket ground, the sports ground it was, which is where the football stadium version 1 and version 2 being built now are, or was. Red Star, I think we played in Melbourne. Can't remember. But anyway, I did have a blinder against Arsenal. Terry Neal was the manager of Arsenal, and he'd been out the year before with Tottenham Hotspur. He was the manager at Spurs, and I'd played for South Australia against Spurs and had a really good game as well. And so then I was talking during this time, I think there'd been conversation with a guy called Alf Darcy, who was an agent. And he's still alive, actually. I got some contact details off about him. She reminded me I've got to try and get in touch with him because this is like 40 years odd down the track. There'd been some contact with him through a third party, and who was the national coach, Jimmy Shoulder, at the time. And he said, look, you should be looking to go and play overseas if you can. So I ended up, got a deal organised to go to Tampa Bay Rowdies because the American league was kicking off. It was with New York Cosmos, with Pele and Chinalia and all those guys playing for the New York Cosmos and all that sort of stuff. And I had a deal to go to Tampa Bay Rowdies in Florida. Which,
nice. That would have been nice.
It would have. I don't know if we'd be talking now because it was party time, but that was on the cards, and I was basically almost ready to go. And I got a call about 2 weeks before I was due to leave that there was an opportunity at Arsenal.
Okay.
So I sort of took that instead, and that's how it worked out because Terry Neal had been manager for at Spurs and seen me playing. He'd been manager at Arsenal when they came out, and we beat them. I think it was 3-0 or 3-1 that night. That was when Malcolm McDonald and Alan Hudson got sent home for misbehaving, and then 6 months later I was teammates of them.
That would have been sort of the interesting sitting across, one where you have a really good game against them, whether they're here on a holiday or whether they put in their best effort. I'm sure wearing the green and gold, you're going to make sure that you try and thump them. And then sitting across the dressing room, being on the same side. Were they warm to you when you landed in?
Look, the senior team were. Because I went straight into the first team dressing room at Arsenal, which was sort of unheard of. Because I remember I got to the airport and I couldn't get through customs because I'd filled in the customs declaration and it had occupation, and I wrote down footballer. And when I got to the customs counter, the guy looked at me and said, "You serious? Like you're an Aussie." And Aussies don't play football, or not our kind of football. And they thought I was having a lend of them. So it took me like over 2 hours. And because there were no mobile phones then, the guy, Alf, was actually waiting on the other side for me to get out. But there was no way to contact each other. So eventually it sort of got sorted out. I had a contact number and I had to go make 3 or 4 different phone calls. But then I didn't even have any English money to change for a phone. So even that became, there was a whole lot of problems. But anyway, that was how it sort of started. Now, I got on the plane in Adelaide, it was 40 degrees, and I got off in London, it was -5 and snowing.
Wow. Is it tough to customise to the English playing conditions?
Yeah, cold killed me. It took me ages to settle down. I didn't have a work permit back then either, so I think I went 6 or 8 weeks where I just trained because I wasn't allowed to play. They never had any permission for me to play. They put me up in digs, and it was a completely different lifestyle. I wasn't ready for it, to be honest. I had no idea what to expect. I thought I was a bit of a big shot and everything was just going to fall into place. But it was a bit of a hard grind at the start. Once things settled down, it was all right. And I was playing. That made a difference, and I actually did all right. I played. I think I had 1 game on the bench off the reserves as a reserve back then. And that was when they only had 1 sub. Before that season finished, Arsenal won the FA Cup that season. No, they didn't. They got beaten by Ipswich that season. Yeah, they did. Got Eric Gates scored the winner. Went to Wembley and watched it. But I was doing all right playing in the reserves. So scoring goals, and once I settled down, it was all right.
And the reserve football, when you're playing in the twos there at Arsenal, who are some of the names that are in the Arsenal first team or the reserve team that then went on to play regularly for Arsenal?
Look, Alan Hudson, I think, played in the reserves. Graham Ricks, I don't know if you remember Graham Ricks, was a regular first teamer. David Price. I think a couple of other senior players would have come back through the reserves. Just trying to think if actually Pat Jennings was the keeper at Arsenal. I can't remember if he had a run in the reserves coming back from injury, but it's a long time ago, mate. But there was a lot of some first team players didn't play reserve football. That was it. They didn't do it.
Yeah.
Even Liam Brady, I think, may have had a run in the reserves at some stage then, coming back from injury. So some decent footballers went through it.
And so you return back to the NSL after spending a season there in London. Back to West Adelaide, where you play a couple of seasons. So are you more comfortable in your home state?
Look, I got a bit homesick, I will be honest. But then actually things were ticking over quite nicely, and I'd played a few games in the first team, sat on the bench a fair bit. As I said, it was only 1 sub then, so you had to be really careful if you made substitutions. I played a couple of what was a
couple of cup games, I think.
Yeah, Champions League, which I can't. They used to call it the European Cup.
Yep, European Cup. Yep.
And so I played a couple of those. I went at home against Red Star. I think I played 2 games against Split, home and away. They were in it. I can't remember the other one. Anyway. So I was actually ticking over all right, and I got an offer to come back, and I took an easy out. It was easy. It was like, I thought, I'll go back to Adelaide and have a good time, and then I'll just see what happens back there, because I hadn't progressed as quickly as I thought I would. Like I said, I was a bit cocky then, and I think I just thought I'd get on and get off the plane and be playing in the first team and playing at Wembley, in 6 weeks' time. It didn't work out that way. I was a bit impatient and a bit naive, to be perfectly honest.
And so we tick over, and then you probably join what some would consider in the early 80s the glamour side of Australian football at Sydney City. From memory, you guys would have at least 3, 4, 5 national team players playing in that Sydney City side, of which you're one of them, and you score goals for fun. And was training harder than match day?
Well, that's sort of, pretty much the best way to describe it. It was training was fairly ruthless. It was very competitive. At Sydney City were a team where the management didn't like losing. and that was Frank Lowy at the time when I went there. Actually, was there for the whole time when I went there. I was there for 6 years. A guy called Andrew Lederer, whose son Paul now runs Western Sydney Wanderers. And so it was a fairly competitive environment. And there was a lot of internationals in that side, or there was some current ones, and there was some ones that were to become internationals, like Steve O'Connor, Joe Watson, Alec Robertson, Murray Barnes. I'd spent time in the national team with previously in that 77-78 World Cup campaign that didn't go too well for Jimmy Shoulder. So I knew Barnesy. Also, Barnesy was a captain in the subsequent 82 World Cup where we got knocked out by New Zealand 2-0.
New Zealand, yeah.
I'd been in and out of the team when I came back from Arsenal because I was at West Adelaide. Rudy Guttendorf, who was the coach at the time, thought that because I was playing in Adelaide, I wasn't good enough to play for the national team. But when I went to Sydney City, he picked me straight away, which it didn't sort of make a lot of sense. But if you knew Rudy Guttendorf, you'd understand or his logic behind it. It was just the way he was. But so I knew a lot of the players. It was a very competitive environment. Eddie Thompson was the coach, and Tomo had been successful at Hibs and at Hearts in Scotland as a pro. Raul Blanco, funnily enough, was actually the first assistant there, and Raul had been around a while as well. And then Mick Hickman came in, and Hickey played, I think, 500 league matches in the UK for clubs like Bolton and Brighton and Hull and Grimsby and I don't know if he was at Bolton. I think he was at Hull and Grimsby. He may have been. Definitely at Brighton. And, Hickey was a winner through and through, and he was the assistant coach. And our warm-ups were harder than most of the matches we played.
Oh, wow.
On games. So that's the sort of environment that you need to have. Training's got to be hard. You train at 100%, then you can, and it's good, then you can play the game at a slower pace.
So I remember speaking to Jerry Gomez, a teammate of yours, often like he would say, how hard training would be in that time frame. Were you one of the players that would uphold that sort of ethos of playing hard, going in hard, and if you played for Sydney City, you definitely earned your spot based on sort of...
Yeah, there was an expectation. That, that was part of me anyway. You don't train at a poor standard. You give everything, and if things don't go right, well, then you've got time to fix them up because it's training. You don't train slow. So that was part of my thing. You work hard, you train hard, you live hard to some extent, and but that's what made Sydney City such a successful club for such a long period of time.
And talk to me, which years do you sort of look back at that time most fondly of?
No, for the club?
Yes, for that club.
Probably, my first couple of seasons, 81, 82, we were premiers. 82, I think we actually played a grand final and St George beat us, but I remember no one really wanted to play. Well, we certainly didn't, because there was no emphasis on winning a grand final. It was like a social thing. It was an add-on at the end of the season.
Yep.
Winning the premiership was what it was all about. And I still tend to think that way. I mean, I grew up with first past the post. And I still have that kind of mentality because for me it's consistency over the length of a season.
Yep.
You can come sixth and almost make the grand final, in this day and age. So, you tailor your team or your trainings now from a coaching perspective, I guess, to maybe peaking if you're not going to win the premiership. I mean, even now clubs still talk about winning the double. It's important that they win the premiership and go on and try and get success in the grand final, like Melbourne City did this year, which was fantastic from their perspective. It was important. But then Paddy Kisnorbo played at Leeds for a long time, and a lot of the players he had played in professional clubs where first past the post is the most important. So, we were, I guess those 2 years, 81, 82, were great. 83, I think we were second. St George actually pipped us that year. They were all good seasons until the clubs, basically the demise at the end of, they played one game in 87. I'd already left because I saw the writing on the wall. And They played one game and then they pulled the pin on the competition or the club. So they ended up having a bye in '87, and that was in Sydney City.
Yeah, so
because there's a lot of history there. I mean, they started off as Socceroo and they've been around for a long time, and a lot of great players actually went through that club and wore that sky blue or that light blue shirt.
So, and like I said, very much the glamour side of that era, with the amount of Socceroos that were in that lineup. So you're featuring pretty heavily now, and you've already touched on a couple of the failed campaigns that you were party of. The one thing that I wanted to speak about is what happened in the 82. 82 bid. Like, what was the feeling? Because we just looked, average, and we don't really talk about 82 in Australia all that much. But what was that feeling like in the camp? And talk to me about what went wrong.
82 was when Rudy had come in. Rudy had come in, I think, would have been 1980. I think after, as I said, he replaced Jimmy Shoulder as a national team coach. Arthur George was the chairman of Soccer Australia. Oh no, it was Australian Soccer Federation then. And he went for Rudy Guttendorf, a German. He'd had 13 clubs in 12 years, so I think that probably spoke enough of it to start with. But there wasn't the bond in the camp and even I know we didn't get there in '78 to Argentina, but was it '78 Argentina? Yeah, it was. We didn't get there, but we came close, and there were legitimate reasons why things didn't work out. The '82 campaign should have been fait accompli because it was the first time we'd been able to qualify directly from Oceania. So we only really had to beat New Zealand.
Yes.
We drew 3-3 with them over there after leading 3-0, I think, from memory. They staged a big second half comeback at Mount Smart Stadium, and the return leg was. I mean, we had to play. There were some other teams that we had to play as well. They were pretty average, local Oceania teams that were fairly easy to beat. So it was only really New Zealand the only competition, and we just weren't prepared properly. The mood in the camp, everybody was flat. I think we'd been overtrained. There was too much of our heads weren't in it. Everyone was gone. There was a whole different training regime that Rudy had tried to implement, and it didn't work. And I don't think he picked the right sort of characters for the squad either. The football team, especially national side, a lot of people look at it and say, why isn't this guy playing for Australia? But in a lot of instances, those guys were maybe good club footballers, but there's a difference between being a good club footballer and a good national team footballer, and being both, obviously. And I don't think he picked the right blend of players. It just didn't gel.
Okay.
And his leadership wasn't great either. It, it just wasn't a good environment within the group. There wasn't a good, it wasn't the camaraderie that I'd felt in my earlier years in the national team, and certainly the camaraderie that came after Frank Arrick took over as well. So that was what stuffed that up, and we just went to play New Zealand. I wasn't even in the squad that day. I'd played against New Zealand in Wellington, in Christchurch, Auckland in the first game, and I didn't even. Here's a good example of what happened. He talked about the team. He didn't name it on the day. We'd trained, we'd practiced. I only found out when I got to the ground that I wasn't even in the squad.
Oh, wow.
So I sat in the stand and watched that game, which I was grateful for because I didn't want to be a part of it at the end result. It was a nightmare. But that's the sort of thing that shouldn't happen.
So having spoken to other members of that squad, there were probably instances where I have heard off the record that there was the competitiveness was actually often encouraged. So, hard tackles at training, maybe some internal conflicts. Would you say that he thought that would bring out the best of Australian football?
Well, look, you've got to be competitive at training, as I've said. I don't remember it being that hard.
Okay.
Physically at training, I think we overtrained sometimes, and training was long and repetitious, and not very productive at the end of it. So I guess it flattened everything. But there was probably some conflict within different members in the team as well. As I said, there wasn't you got to get your personalities right as well.
Yes.
There's got to be a culture that
chemistry.
And the culture wasn't there. And that's a word that's a 21st century word. But, in my club days at Polonia, we had what was a good culture. And we played as a team and worked for each other. And there was a strong bond between, even like, and I came through with a few younger guys. Well, I mean, one of my best mates at that time in my early days at Polonia was Ollie Bozanic's father, Vic. And like we'd played all of our junior football together, and there was a couple of other guys that I'd played junior football with that we'd all got into the first team around about the same time, and that contributed to the success of the team. We had a coach, a guy called Henry Manka, that was a Polish international that spoke broken English, but it was fun the way that he used to speak, and and he used to play on it. We used to have a good time. With Rudy Guttendorf, there was no good time.
Okay.
You dreaded going into camp because it was just going to be boring, monotonous. He had a whole lot of probably not sensible rules in place, and so it killed off any sense of team spirit, I guess. And I know everybody wanted to play for the Socceroos, but we just we were browbeaten. And so for me, it wasn't even about training. Training, as I said, was monotonous.
Okay.
And at times confusing. There was a lot of mixed messages. Rudy was all over the shop. He wasn't the right guy for the job. End of story.
Talk to me now the difference between, let's say, his character now, somebody like Frank Arrock, who was so just unique in his mannerisms and his ideas about football, and the type of personnel that he brought in. So he had a philosophy of the types of people that he wanted to be in that squad, and I think you fit into that mold.
Well, Frank, from one of the things he said was he wanted a team of bastards, and that was a word he used quite often because he figured the bastards were going to win games for him, and so he picked a lot of guys that hadn't had a look in with the national team before, guys like, say, hard-nosed blokes like Steve O'Connor, who was a teammate of mine at Sydney City, David Ratcliffe, an ex-Englishman that played at St George with Frank, Kenny Murphy from Melbourne came in, Joe Watson he had a sniff around the national team before, but nothing consistent. So it was, he looked at players that were going to do a job for him. And he picked characters as well, and we had a really good bond within that group. Okay. And, you're not going to get 20 odd blokes in a camp in love with each other. It doesn't work that way. But we all played for each other.
Yes.
It was Charlie Yankos was another one that came in with Frank as well, and so it worked out okay. Frank put a good squad together.
Yeah, and
he had a clear vision of how he wanted the team to play.
Of all your goals against opposition, you scored many for Australia. Any stand out for you that you think, okay, yeah, that?
Oh, it's a hard question. I think I get 25 international goals. There was a lot of goals against clubs as well.
Yes, friendlies are probably not all of them are.
Yeah, look, I don't remember most of them, to be honest. I think I ended up with about 40 all up. I'd pick a club game. We played Vasco da Gama.
Okay. Was that at the cricket ground, at the Melbourne Cricket Ground?
Yeah, it was. And we played Spurs, again, funnily enough, I think. Spurs, Vasco da Gama, and Udinese. We played, and it was a round robin competition.
Yes. Yep.
And we ended up playing. Basco beat us in Sydney. We beat Udinese in Adelaide at Footy Park back then, which is now gone. And we had a draw, I think, with Spurs and I think that was at the MCG as well. And so we had to play Vasco da Gama in the final of this round robin. And there was a bit of money at stake as well. And we ended up beating them 2-0 or 2-1. And I scored both goals, but the second one I was a cracker. I remember curling one in. I beat two players outside the box and then curled one in the pigeonhole. And so that one stands out. The header against Israel in the World Cup over there at Ramat Gan Stadium. And that was a madhouse. That was the day that the game where Kenny Murphy got sent off 20 minutes into the first half, and Frank Arrick got sent off from the bench 10 minutes afterwards. And we're up against it. There was 40,000 mad Israelis packed into a pretty primitive sort of stadium. And we ended up, surviving that. We scored twice, and then they got one back. And but Terry Greedy, who was the goalkeeper, got subbed off with a busted forehead. And Jeff Olver had I think it was his international debut, like a first serious game. He played other games, but not certainly not something of that importance. And he had a blinder. So it was an interesting game. I scored a header that way as well, and that was not a bad header from what I can remember. But I suppose if I had more time to think about it, I'd probably come up with a few more. They all count. They're all important, mate. They're all good goals.
Yes. Doesn't matter how they go.
Bad goal, as long as your name's on it.
Yes, very true. And who did you tend to room with when you went away for the
Steve O'Connor for a good chunk of it with Frank.
Okay.
And
that was because of your time
in '84 with a guy, and I roomed with. We had 6 weeks away, and I had roomed with a guy called Phil O'Connor, who's now dead, God rest his soul. Great bloke, good player, really good character, and we had a ball for that 6 weeks, and then the next year the World Cup. That was '84. The next year, the World Cup qualifiers started, and I ended up rooming with Steve, with Rocky, as his name was, and that was it for that 12 months. And then after that, it all finished because we got knocked out by Scotland at the end of that year.
Yes, a sad day. And Frank said that, I don't know how strong it was, but he wanted the game to be played somewhere like in Darwin.
Yeah, he did.
At a cow paddock. But no, we played at Olympic Park in probably ideal conditions for what was a star-studded Scotland side. But it was a good game, and we probably could have had that game.
I missed a header that I should have scored. I still think about that now, and I probably wouldn't do anything any different if I had it all over again. I think Jim Leighton. It's funny because Jim Leighton was a Scottish goalkeeper, and a lot of Scottish blokes I reckon he only ever played one game for Scotland, and he played quite a few. But they said the only game he really played was against us that night. He made 3 or 4 unbelievable saves.
Yes.
It was just pure luck. My header, he threw his arms up and it hit him in the arm. It wasn't a deliberate thing. It was just a reflex action. I think Jarkov hit one from outside the box, and he put his hands there, dipped and swerved, and he put his arms up to stop it. It swung between his arms and hit him in the head. Jimmy Patikas had one that hit him somewhere in the body that he had no real idea about. It was a game that we needed to win 3-0, and we could have actually won it 3-0 that night. But Jim Leighton made 3 outstanding saves.
Yeah. The after your time at Sydney City, you also spent some time at Olympic. Obviously you touched on the fact that how Sydney City folded the year that you went across to Olympic. So you said you saw the writing on the wall. So why Olympic? Obviously another big club in the area, but why Olympic and not any other team?
No, they were the ones that made the offer.
Okay.
So I think they were looking to rebuild, but then Olympic at the time were always looking to rebuild. And it's funnily, strangely enough, Eddie Thompson ended up there after Sydney City folded. not long after they put a coach in. So I think there'd probably been a lot going on behind the scenes. The whole Sydney City thing, the rumours had been out for a lot of that previous season that they weren't going to survive another year, but they sort of did. But I remember talking to Tomo, and Tomo said, look, it's probably move along. Olympic have made a good offer. They paid money to Sydney City. I got decent coin out of it as well at the time, from memory, and which my ex-wife got most of, I think, at the end of it. And so that was just how it worked out. But it wasn't, the club wasn't stable. It was all over the shop. The coach they brought in, and I can't even remember his name. He's actually a nice guy, but he wasn't ready for National League. And it was interesting, me being at Olympic, because we'd had a lot of battles over the years. Not so much when I was at West Adelaide, but certainly with Sydney City, there was a really strong rivalry between the clubs. Really strong, almost to the point of hatred. And we'd had some pretty nasty sort of incidents. I don't know if you remember the Pratton Park riot.
Yes, I did. I remember speaking to Marshall Soper about that. So Marshall,
on one side of the fence, and then going to play at the club that where there'd been a lot of things hadn't gone nicely against us. It was an interesting dynamic. Let me put it that way. But I'll be honest with you. I'll look back now, and the management, from what I can remember, was pretty good. Tom DeMarnis, I think, was the chairman at the time, and I got on pretty well with Tom. But it wasn't the same. With Sydney, me leaving Sydney, I'd sort of found a home at Sydney City that was like I'd felt when I was a kid growing up at Polonia.
Yes.
We had that kind of feeling. Even at West Adelaide in the first part of the National League, it was all right. But after that, it chopped and changed a bit. And I came back to the guy that brought me back from Arsenal, didn't see the season out, a guy called Tom Ford. And then the next season, Jerry Childy came. And Jerry Childy had been the coach at Sydney City. And Jerry didn't see the season out. So it was a lot of instability in the club. And you don't build a club when your management's that stable and you're chopping and changing coaches all the time. And, it's still it still happens a hell of a lot in the game. People wonder why, clubs aren't successful. It's an interesting thing. So, yeah, for me, leaving Sydney City, I didn't really want to go, but I got the impression that it wasn't going to survive anyway. And Tomo had been Tomo and I were pretty close. We had good mates, and he'd sort of more or less said, look, it might last, it might not last, but it's not the place you really want to be. And funnily enough, he ended up at Olympic. So you can work that one out for yourself, but it wasn't the same, same sort of culture that I'd come from.
And obviously he was in that makeup of that Socceroo's coaching side, assistant to Frank, and then took over afterwards. But what was his mentality like in the change room?
Who, Frank's or Tomo's?
Tomo's.
I remember Tomo used to, he'd do the team talk before the game, and it was all pretty much the same. And at Sydney City, there's a lot of experience in that dressing room, and we used to take the mickey out of him sometimes as well, and do things that would actually make him angry, or he'd mess around when he was talking and stuff like that. But generally, he knew he could, we could get a result. It's funny because, as the club started to, I guess probably the first mention that the club was going to fold was back in the early part of the 80s.
Okay.
And it sort of kept bobbing up, and no one really wanted to go, but they stopped investing in bringing players into the club. And because Tomo's thing was he'd bring in one player a year, or maybe two. He brought me in the end of 1980, and Kenny Bowden. The next year, he brought Dave Mitchell in. A couple of years down the track, Frank Farina came out of the AIS. And so...
Yeah, that's a formidable strike force, isn't it?
And Mitch came and sort of went because he was off going to Scotland trying to get himself a career overseas as well, and I'd settled down and married by then, and so my overseas days were gone. I had a kid and all that sort of stuff, so it wasn't going to happen for me again. So yeah, but the club had stopped really investing in what they could do for the future, and it wasn't. I don't think it was as important to win the competition as it once it had been. Frank had lost interest in Australian football, I think, because it just wasn't going anywhere. The NSL was like a revolving door of clubs.
Mm.
They were in one season, they were gone for two, they'd come back in, and I can't remember. There's some ridiculous amount of clubs. I think it was over 40 clubs.
Yeah, it was split. Yeah, in that mid '80s, it was split into the two divisions.
Well, that was the other thing as well, which I'd forgotten about. That was 84 and 85, or 85 and 86, and then 87 it came back to being a national competition again. They had the Northern Conference and the Southern Conference.
That's right.
That might have been 85. I think it might have been for 2 years.
Yes, probably it was.
Yeah, so that was problematic. The league wasn't really going anywhere. The game wasn't really progressing. Had we made the World Cup in '86 against Scotland, it may have made a difference. But then, you know what, I often look back and think, you talk about that campaign and, had we gone to Darwin and qualified, it probably wouldn't have changed things the way that qualifying in 2006 did, because the game was mismanaged. End of story. And, we could have gone to the World Cup in Argentina in '78. We could have gone to Mexico in '86. And it wouldn't have made an ounce of difference, because it would have got stuffed up when we got back anyway. We went to the Olympics in '88, the first time since '56.
Yeah, so you were. I was going to touch on that. You're obviously an Olympian, and you guys had a pretty successful Merlon Cup as well in Singapore. That was.
We had two actually. I forgot that. We
so
82 and '83. The first year Les Scheinflug went. That was after Rudy had missed out, and we won it.
Yeah,
that year in '82, and then Les was away with the Joeys at the in Mexico at the under. No, it wasn't the Joeys. It was the under-20s, young Socceroos, the World Cup in Mexico in '83, and so Frank took a tournament that we had against England. Funnily enough, 3 games: Sydney, Brisbane, and Melbourne. And we had a win, a draw. No, we had a draw, a loss. We didn't win. It must have been 2 draws. Anyway, we had a draw at the SCG. We had a draw in Melbourne. We lost in Brisbane 1-0. And so Frank took the squad for England. And then Les came back, and Frank ended up keeping the job, which is probably a good thing, because I don't think, Les is still around, but I wasn't a fan of his management style either. It sort of worked, but it was a bit old school. And Frank let players be. He treated us like men, not like kids. Put it that way. It's the best way to put it.
And you probably need that discipline. I think that the reason why he kept the young Socceroos job for so long is you're molding young adults into men. That hard German discipline. And order, discipline, and Frank had sort of inspired, the characters to come out. You're talking about being bastards. So you had a couple of successful campaigns in Singapore, that Merlon Cup, and then
we played some good sides, mate. We played China, we played South Korea, who were a good side back then. They were good days actually. They were good trips.
Yeah, and obviously you touched on the fact that you got to be an Olympian as well. So tell me about that experience.
Yeah, that it's funny because we played with the national team. I played a tournament against Czechoslovakia. I think in '86 they came out, and I'd had enough. My second kid was on the way. I basically had lost the sort of burning desire to play for the national team.
Okay.
And so I thought I've got to settle down, and so I did. And then I'd missed out in '87, no national team representation had finished. I'd sort of pretty much said, no, I'm not interested. And then I didn't have a good season in '87, like a good club season. And I remember thinking, I've got to pull my finger out. I know I didn't work as hard as I had been. I wasn't as committed as I had been. I mean, dedication is probably a word you could use, but it depends on how you dedicate yourself. I think commitment comes before dedication. You don't get dedication without commitment. And so then I figured at the end of '87 that I needed to sharpen up a little bit. So I had a really good off season and worked really hard. And then Frank asked me to come back and play a game, and I cannot remember who it was against. It's funny, I was thinking about it the other day, and it was at Parramatta Stadium, and Parramatta Stadium had only just opened, I think, and so we played. It was a touring side, and it was a Balkan side. It could have been a Croatian team actually. It might have even been split. I don't know. But anyway, Frank invited me to come back. I came back and played. We won the game, scored a couple of goals. Set Frank Farina up. I remember that. It popped in. And probably the reason why is because I spoke to Frank a couple of days ago, and that reminds me I've got to ring him because we're going to go out and have a coffee somewhere. But no, that's, and then it sort of stayed from there. And I ended up going to the Olympics, which I hadn't planned on. But I gave it a good crack, and I enjoyed that. So that was good. I'd played. I'd come off the bench. I had a few injuries that were starting to catch up with me.
Yeah.
And I came off the bench a couple of games before that. I'd missed out on that Gold Cup actually where we beat Argentina.
Yes.
I got injured in one game there and didn't get back in the side. I'd played one game.
Against miraculous result, probably.
It was
miraculous.
4-1 at the Sydney Football Stadium. It was an unbelievable night.
Yes.
Anyway, we got to Seoul, and I was on the bench for the first game, and then Frank and I had a chat, and I said, Frank, look, I didn't come here for a holiday, mate, but I came to play. And so he said, all right. So we started, and we beat Yugoslavia the game one. I think Brazil, I sat on the bench, which I was happy for, game two, because Romario just slaughtered us. Right? And Bebeto, Taffarel was in goal. They had a couple of guys that went on to play for Brazil in the World Cup in '92 or 1990, sorry. And so I didn't mind missing out then, but I spoke to Frank and said, mate, I want to have a game. Like I said, I didn't come here for nothing. And Frank actually said to me, well, it was like a thank you for what you've contributed to the game. And I said, well, I don't care about thank yous. You should have left me home. Remember having the conversation with him, plain as you and I are talking now. So he started me against Nigeria. We needed to win. I'd scored the goal. We won 1-0.
Happy days.
And that was it. Yep. So he sat me on the bench against Russia. In the quarterfinal, they killed us. They ended up winning the competition, but
but a good side. A good side. You then went on to have a season at Apia and I think then play in the state league in New South Wales. And then soon after retiring, you had a string of managerial spouts. But I mean, talk to me about that Asian Cup where you supported Graham Arnold in his first go at being the Socceroo's coach. What was that like?
There was I'd coached Adelaide United. I had a fair bit of experience in it. I had, basically a season or two seasons of 05, 06 and 06, 07 of A-League.
Where you won the league. Yeah, where you won the league.
And I had, 5, 7 years of 8 years of NSL at that stage. So Arnie, and we'd played together, so he asked me to be assistant, and I was happy to do it. It was always going to be difficult to get that team to live up to the expectations that had been set in World Cup the year before in Germany in 06. Gus Hiddink came in. We know Frank Farina was the manager. He got the bullet. Gus Hiddink came in and sort of sparked the team up and got them through. Everyone remembers that night in November 2005. And getting the World Cup performance captured the hearts and minds of the Australian sporting public, not just the football public. It was our first World Cup for, was it 32 years? Yeah, it was 32 years. And so there was a lot of positive publicity about it. So the team was on a hiding to nothing. The players were cooked. We went there with big name players. Tim Cahill went there injured. Harry Kewell went there injured. John Aloisi went there injured. There was a few. Lucas Neal didn't actually make it into the training camp until the lead up to that. He'd been on a beach in Thailand for 2 weeks. But the players had gone from a Confederations Cup in one off season to a World Cup qualifying year. They went to the World Cup in 2006 and then straight back into European club seasons. And so they came out of like pretty much no break for 3 years, 2 to 3 years. And so it was always going to be difficult to get success. And I know, people bagged Arnie, but the team actually didn't do too bad. I know Mark Viduka, for example, had to have his arm twisted to basically come and play. He didn't really want to play. And in the end, he did. So and there was a few new players in the squad as well, that Arnie was sort of looking at for the future. And so it was never going to live. It was not doomed to fail, but the chances of success were slim because of just the circumstances around it. But at the end of the day, we got beaten in a quarterfinal by Japan. And we got beaten on penalties. And the two players that missed the penalties were Harry Kewell and Lucas Neal. So it wasn't like, had that been different, we got the semi-final, then is it successful?
Yes, it is.
But there was an anti-Arnie sentiment
going
around the game at that stage as well, for a whole lot of different reasons, which I'm not going to go into. But there was an anti-Arnie sentiment, and it wasn't right. And so it was driven by a couple of people that probably don't have the public profile in the game that they did back then. And so that wasn't right, and it was, as I said, a lot of I guess negativity came out of those results, that outcome of that Asian Cup, and for all the wrong reasons. There were personal agendas involved in that.
Okay, that's sad.
Yeah, it's endemic in football. It still happens now. Happens anywhere around the world, and that's the beauty of the game, but it's also its downfalls, particularly in this country.
And so you talk about that experience of managing Adelaide. The rivalries between Adelaide and Melbourne Victory. Your obviously the combination of that 2005-2006 premiership year. You coached many other sides afterwards, but as a manager, would you say that's really your happiest time coaching?
It wasn't. It was look. I'll be honest. The best time I could recollect from coaching was when I started coaching Warringah Dolphins, which is now Manly United.
Okay.
And I had 2 years there before I went to the NSL. Okay. And they were we got a good bunch of blokes. We came second or third in the first year. The second year we won everything. We won the premiership and the double, and it was a decent competition. And it was that camaraderie thing again, We had a great bunch of blokes. I actually coached at a school here in Brisbane, and one of the kids I coached, his father was in that Dolphins team.
Okay.
And we often talk about that, and they've had reunions. I've been back and spoke at the club, and they had a 20th year reunion and a 25-year reunion, and all that kind of thing. So that's Sydney City do that. We get together at least once a year if we can. I mean, it's been a nightmare the last couple of years because of
COVID. Yeah.
Yeah, and it probably looks like it's going to go the same way this year. But But we've kept in touch.
Mm.
So that was important. And I think Adelaide United in the first couple of years was really good, but then politics got involved in the club and personalities, it wasn't ever about, it was always about the club and the team. And that's the ethos that Adelaide United built.
Mm.
And it's funny because I was talking to one of the players that I coached in those first couple of years there, and I'll use it was Ross Aloisi, and he said to me only 3 days ago that it's funny because the culture within the club now is like it was in those first couple of years. The club lost its way. I think that Gordon Pickard, who was the benefactor at the time, basically set it up, and he engaged the local football community.
Mm.
And to go back and actually coach, even and there was one season of NSL there as well, so I had 3 seasons there. We had a great relationship with the local public. The first game of Adelaide United at Hindmarsh, which is now Cooper, 17,500, they turned 5,000 away. It was packed. October 2003. October 17, I think it was, 2003. And it was an unbelievable
atmosphere
feeling, atmosphere within the stadium, but within the city. Okay. And like Adelaide, you're talking Aussie rules heartland. It was they don't even have the Crows and Port Power, and that's all anyone ever talked about when you talked about South Australia. And all of a sudden, Adelaide United's kicked in. So they were good years as well, but the politics ended up taking over there, which is why I ended up leaving. Ross left as well, and they had a checkered history since. They had success in 2015, I think. And so that was after a lot of years of not quite getting there. But they've got that back now, and they've done it by putting local kids in the team.
Yes,
and that's made a massive difference to the culture within the club, and also the feeling of the relationship between Adelaide United and the local public.
Understood. So you've played at the highest level. You've coached many sides, and so what advice do you have for that 15, 16, 17-year-old boy or girl who wants to take their football to the next level? What do you tell them?
Get your basics right to start with. Football's not about step overs and drag backs and back heels and nutmegs and stuff like that. Make sure you can get all the basics right, but you've got to be prepared to work. I don't care what people say, you've got to apply yourself. You've got to work at it, and it's not going to happen overnight. And especially with a lot of young kids these days, just shut up and do what the coach tells you.
Fantastic words of wisdom. Thank you so much, John Cozzy, for your contribution to Australian football. You've been at times very much at the forefront, leading from the top. And I see you're still involved in the game, so congratulations. But very much as a supporter of our game, would like to thank you and wish you all the very best.
Thanks, Sasha. No problems, mate.
Hey, guys. We've come to the end of this episode. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to our wonderful guest. If you like this type of content and would like to see more, how about you hit the like and subscribe button? And have a fantastic day.